meetings before, just a reminder that we are going to talk a little bit about kind of the focus of today's peer-to-peer is to talk about alternatives to detention. We'll use that to the first half of the meeting to kind of introduce ourselves, reintroduce ourselves if you are new to us, and then also to kind of discuss some research we've done, some practices that we've seen. We never like to sit here and say that we are the experts. This is why you are here as well. And so we'll kind of discuss some of the research that we have found, but then really the later half of the meeting will be dedicated to having conversations. And so just a fair warning that right now we're kind of letting you guys kind of listen in, but we do want you to lead the conversations within your own group. So we will be moving into breakout sessions about halfway through this presentation today. So just kind of heads up there. But again, welcome, alternatives to detention. Moving on, can everybody see my slide? It's been a moment since I've done a Zoom, so I just want to make sure everybody can hear me. Fantastic. We are joined here today by the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, represented today by their president and CEO, David. I'll have him introduce himself in a second, but just a couple of reminders. Some of you have seen the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys represented in different events. Some of you met Cheryl, who attended some of our site visits to Ohio. So shout out to all my Ohio people. Thank you for being here today. Cheryl, unfortunately, but also fortunately, is actually leaving the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys to return to their work as a prosecutor, which is pretty exciting. But so what you'll see is a little bit of a shift. Eric, who some of you have met during our in-person peer-to-peer, will be joining us and coming in to really do some of that groundwork with the sites, with each of our sites. But really, now that we've had at least a year under our belt for this grant, as we enter, the new 2024 year, which is crazy, we're really kind of looking to dive more into the actual work of what do we need to do to end the criminalization of minor victims? And then again, specifically for today's peer-to-peer, to talk about the alternatives to detention. And so the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys will be kind of diving more and working more with sites to work closely to identify the need of the role of prosecutors to actually doing that. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to David and give a better introduction to himself, me blabbering on. So David, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure, of course. And good morning / afternoon, everyone. I'm one of those East Coasters, so it's afternoon, but I know we've got some folks, and originally being from California, I know it's 9 o'clock. So welcome to the beginning of your workday. My name is David Levon. I'm the president and CEO of the National Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. I want to start right there because the Ohio friends, we are not the Ohio Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, but we are a national group representing offices throughout the country, including all of the states that are involved in these 6 sites. We are very fortunate to join the National Council. We've had a long relationship with the council, working on various projects, but especially when you look at juvenile, we did a lot of work in the juvenile from the schools, and I think that's going to come up later, into the courts. And on behalf of prosecutors, we didn't go to lawyer school. We didn't spend our time, and nor did the judges or the defense lawyers, to try to work on the issues like school discipline. So as we talked about here, the criminalization of especially the minor victims, as an organization, we are very committed to this mission. In fact, looking forward to the alternatives to detention, because I think that is one of those questions. What do we do with the victims, and how do we keep them safe and address their needs and make sure that they are properly respected? So I look forward to listening as much as anything. And then as MJ kind of led up and talking to Lauren and also Sherry here on the council team, now it becomes a question, how can prosecutors help? So we're going to move into a different phase for more of technical assistance. Can we, and I think you're going to have some questions in your breakouts, is first off, are the prosecutors involved in your various projects? And if they're not, can we get them? And I understand, they're not funded by this grant and such, but however this is a US DOJ funded Office of Victims of Crime program. And I think there's a lot of symmetry here if we can get to the mission, which is addressing human trafficking and addressing that victimization. So I don't come here. I've had a almost 40-year career, both as a trial prosecutor and now working at the association level. I know sometimes we're not the most popular people. I know that and I understand in some of the sites there may be already conflicts between some of your organization and the prosecutor's office. but we're here to try to build that bridge, open those lines of communication. We want to build a cohort between all 6 sites and the prosecutors working there so they can support each other as well as exchange ideas. And then we will also bring in what we call our prosecutor fellows. So prosecutors have been working in the trafficking area, especially the juvenile area, for a long time to try to reduce the noise and explain why these procedures or protocols may be very, very helpful for the sites. So we hope to be able to hear from especially all 6 of the site leads as to what is the role right now and what could be the role or how could we be helpful. And then please don't sugarcoat it, right? Don't come in and say, oh, everything's great. It's more important to address the areas of friction or some of the historical problems that have existed to see if we can overcome those. Because if we can overcome those and do it legitimately, then this is that real opportunity. So please use us if we have an opportunity or you want to. And I think my contact information is on there. As was said, Eric is continuing to be on this project, reaching out to Eric, letting him know. Let's set up a call and chat if you're so inclined, or just send us a note as to what the role could be. So that's where we're trying to go. Also think of things like MOUs, protocols, policies, things that would be very, very helpful to build this bridge. So I'm pleased to be a part of this call, very much available to chat with any of you, and please, make us work. We know that it may be an easy job, it may be a hard job, but we're in it because we believe in this mission and very much believe that we can do better. I think prosecutors are those sort of conveners or a piece to the puzzle, but all of you are on the front lines. So I look forward to more listening than trying to provide any guidance at this moment. So thank you.
Thank you, David. And I loved that kind of the whole attitude. That's essentially why we are here, again, to listen and to learn, but also to assist where we can. We've already, identified some of you that are on this call are prosecutors. So we thank you so much for just being here today as well. If you're interested in that discipline cohort, if you're just interested in learning more, or those of you that are site representatives want to do kind of more interactions with APA, again, please contact your site manager. Send us a message, let us know. Again, Eric or David, but more likely Eric will be joining us on those check-in meetings that you're having with your site managers on the monthly or bi-monthly basis. But we'll get started. If you've been to one of our peer-to-peers or any of our trainings, you know that we like to be interactive. And one of the ways that we like to be interactive is by using Slido. So we're gonna have a couple Slido questions here just to kind of gauge where everybody's opinions are before we, jump into the meat of the conversation later on. But just kind of a question to open up: what are the harms of detention for youth who have been affected by human trafficking? So 2 ways that you can respond to this. It does come up anonymously, so you can kind of say whatever you'd like to say. Scan that QR code and send us your response, or you can go ahead and click on this link, slido.com, type in that number 1075-657, and you can go ahead and start responding. But if you want to go and let us know, I see 2 people already participating. What are the harms of detention for youth who have been affected by human trafficking? And as you guys are responding, I want to note, I know that this particular subject obviously is one that is essential to ending the criminalization of youth. That being said, we also know it's not an easy or simple answer. Again, we're going to provide some guidance, but there are gray areas and there are, sometimes limitations. And so we want to acknowledge the difficulties in that, but also acknowledge some solutions possibly, or other ways of thinking. But so just kind of noting some things. We see re-victimization in detention, re-traumatization. Those are big ones. David, feel free to come off mute too if you see ones and you want to kind of comment on them. Exposure to youth with violent crimes, triggering trauma, not building relationships. Yep. Complex trauma comes up a lot. Further harassment. Reduced access to resources. And sometimes we see people say the opposite to that the reason why that they're getting put in detention is because there are more resources in there, which that in itself is a problematic thing, right? Learning detention habits, exposure to gang activity, institutionalization.
So MJ, that's you invited me to comment a little bit. That's from the prosecutor perspective. That's what gang activity, detention habits, institutionalization. Those are whoever those anonymous folks are. They're spot on for what we see and why it is so dangerous, especially to put them with the delinquent use.
For sure. The last one that we popped on, we'll move on. They're connecting with other youth and being blamed for grooming. Yeah, it's kind of it's twofold, right? They're being put in the situation, as already David mentioned, and then they're getting blamed for grooming. It's a difficult place to be in when you're being exposed in that sense. So we acknowledge all the things you hit. Again, as David said, you hit all of them. So kind of just first talking about what are the detention risks, and on the side of this slide we pointed out the number of resources we use to kind of comment and supplement today's presentation. But we know that it exacerbates their complex trauma. There's an exacerbation of mental illness, high risk of suicide and self-harm. I'm not going to go through each one because you guys know these so well. But also just to kind of, we can send you the PowerPoint slides afterwards. But a big one that comes up a lot when we're talking to sites is this idea of loss of agency over self. We know that in the situation of being victimized, of being trafficked, there is already a loss of such agency. And so to be put further to a place of being kind of, not manipulated, but losing your sense of identity is further trauma to do, exposure to further abuse. Some of the collateral consequences must be arrested to be detained. The number of youth being held in detention actually has increased since the pandemic. We've seen numbers kind of go up across the board, not just for related work or related charges for trafficking, but across the board. And then, kind of noting too, one of the resources we used was discussing kind of the widening gaps between race and place. We already know that youth of color, youth of representing any populations that are marginalized are higher risk of being not only trafficked, but also high risk of being placed into detention. Black youth are actually 10 times more likely to be detained than white youth. Again, preaching to the choir, there are not anything that I'm not saying. And we also note that some of the detention risks come because there is a lack of disparity. One consistent thing that I hear from not just the sites on this grant, but from the sites that I work with all of our human trafficking grants, is because there is a lack of placement, oftentimes there's nowhere else to put youth. And so there's a lack of resources and placements, and we often hear this only way to protect them. We acknowledge that, we recognize it, but then we also have to consider, in doing so, what are the other risks that we're posing them to? Are we further pushing them down the juvenile justice system? And then at that point, the work that has been done to try to remedy that, is it being kind of slowly diminished in that? So again, we acknowledge that this is a difficult subject, but also understanding what is the risk there when we further expose them. If we understand that this is not the best practice, what are some ways to try to at least supplement it or avoid it earlier on? So we're going to talk a lot about that today. Any comments to make, David?
The only comment was and you and I chatted about it yesterday, the quote's at the bottom, the only way to protect them. And as I shared, I was recently in Atlanta and I was with the chief probation officer there for Fulton County. And we were out to dinner at probably 10 o'clock at night. A 14-year-old victim of trafficking had just gotten picked up. And it became that question of what you do. She was in foster care. She had a long history of being a runner, drug and alcohol addiction issues. And here it was in the middle of the night. And it's like, what do we do? And the law enforcement agency, the police department was calling over to probation saying, hey, we've got this person. Do you have a place? So I think the challenge for all of us is, other than taking it to what juvenile, and I'll use the phrase juvenile hall or juvenile detention, where can you do that at the middle of the night? And also in this case, there was a real belief that those that were trafficking her would break her out. One of the reasons why the guardians were not doing anything, or foster parents, was that they were afraid of those that were trafficking her. So I think it is a real challenge. I think we're all in it together. But I never like to go in an area where they say, well, it's what we've always done, or it's the only way to quote protect. I think we can do better.
Agreed. And so we kind of want you to briefly, with this next question, to evaluate how do you think your community's juvenile justice system is currently utilizing detention. So again, you can go ahead and scan that QR code, or you can go ahead and type in this number to Slido. It should be coming right up if you're following along. But do you think they're using it too often, just right, too little? Again, this is anonymous, so you can kind of say however you feel. We'll just see those numbers kind of pop in. So far, it seems like everybody thinks it's been used too often.
MJ, can I ask a clarifying question?
Of course.
Is this poll related to the utilization of juvenile detention in general, or specifically for a traffic population?
I think for the purposes of this particular, grant and peer-to-peer, I would say with trafficking. Great question. Thanks, Dan. As we're considering that, though, too, that's something in conjunction with this meeting, as we are looking at our juvenile justice systems in our community, is detention just a practice in general? And that might be something that to consider in thinking about alternatives, is how do we address the use of this? Because it bleeds into other things, right? Well, we do it for everything else, so why not do it for trafficking victims? And understanding these are two very different things. There are many other resources. So, okay, it seems like most people said that it's being used too often. A few people said that it's just being used just right, which is, if that's the perspective there, that and it might be. We know that a lot of juvenile justice systems are also trying to be more less punitive, right? That is generally the viewpoint, but sometimes those practices kind of fall short in the midst of, especially now, again, there's been an increase in detention use since the pandemic. So what do we need to kind of clean up a little bit? What do we need to reevaluate? What do we need to look at? Nobody says it's being used too little. I probably expected the exact same thing. So we'll move on to the kind of the bulks of, some of our, and I don't want to say recommendations, but from, again, the research that we've seen. So alternatives to detention should be considered at each decision point, and we've identified these decision points as prior to arrest, at the time of arrest or during intake, pre-adjudication, post-adjudication, probation, and aftercare. And we acknowledge that many types of diversion and other alternatives are being used commonly. You guys could probably spout out a number of them, and we're going to do so in a moment. But again, just reevaluating where these alternatives are being used and being available to leverage, and kind of just deciding, are there other places we are looking at? And so really today is, as we're looking at the work that we are doing, where do we have gaps and how do we kind of refine those gaps? And again, David, at any point, please, you don't need to just unmute yourself and add on to the conversation. I also invite, I'm joined, and I should have done this earlier on. Most of you know Lauren Beal, our senior program manager, and Sherry Ely is also on this call. Both of them just returned from a very light flight for a different conference that we had. So please interrupt me as you see fit.
So MJ, I think that's something, and I think we're going to get there, but I know I've focused a lot on the prosecutors, but also being one of the system actors, the importance of, especially here, probation in the juvenile system, and how we can help align or work with the probation department to try to figure this out, especially when you're talking about alternatives to detention. Because many of the times when you got here at arrest or intake, many systems, it's the probation department that's doing that intake. And that is another place to cut the detention off and be able to get into an alternative. So I think as folks think about what could be the role of the prosecutor, please also think of the other system actors. And most probation departments are under the council, under the juvenile judges. And so how do we get the system to also respond, not just a single system actor?
And David, I love that you said that, because that's one of the reasons why, if you notice for this peer-to-peer, the original one that we did, We had mostly just the representatives for the grant, but we are really, now that we've done all our site visits, I just want to emphasize again that these meetings, these conversations, the resources, everything that is associated with this grant is to be used and to be shared with each of your stakeholders at any point. And so, thank you for expanding that. We invited a lot of different people today, and we want to continue doing so. But it's really understanding again how the whole web works to either do this well or not do it well, right? So again, kind of further breaking down, stakeholders at all decision points should consider how bias is built. And I loved going back to Dan's comment, again, we are focusing on the victims of human trafficking, the systems within that, but then also overall, we should constantly be looking at bias. In this age of, DEI, and I don't want to say age, it's something that we're carrying on, forward. How are these biases built into assessing a youth's crimogenic risk factors, right? We know history of arrest, but also looking at the association with negative peers and the justice system in general. Again, going back to our conversation about alternatives to detention, or excuse me, what are the harms to detention? Are we putting them in those places and those environments where we already know that it's not a great environment? And then of course, race and background, gender identities, the whole SOGI spectrum, all of these things affect the impact of identified risk and the level of confinement decisions. And so how are you identifying that bias? How often are you assessing it? And what questions are we asking to kind of just make sure? And then that's a good time too, a reminder that for this grant, DEI training is a requirement. And so kind of looking and assessing that as well. Prior to arrest, what can we do to decriminalize youth behaviors such as truancy, curfew violations, ungovernability? These were many of the things that several of you listed when we did our interviews during our site visits as reasons why youth are being arrested. Many of you know that I come from an education background, and as a former teacher, this particular slide really reached out to me and asking ourselves a question of why youth are not going to school. We know with the pandemic, it was really difficult to, keep track of truancies, to keep track of absences. And now that we are, have returned to somewhat normalcy, are we looking at those policies with schools and understanding where, again, are those gaps and where are those issues and where are the youth being identified? I had a question or a conversation with one of my sites during a site visit, and it was kind of shocking to some people. We had some educators that came to the site visit, which was fantastic. But it was really this moment of clarity when we discussed with all these different stakeholders of understanding that when a youth is considered truant in a lot of school systems, and there's not any follow-up, they kind of just disappear into the void. And I personally know, and working in education, that oftentimes, especially as we got closer to senior year, it was playing like hot potato with the kid. We knew if that kid was not on track to graduate, and being very, open right now, principals would kind of play hot potato to move that kid around because they did not want to take didn't want to get hit because of graduation rates, which is a terrible system of that. And so those spaces and those gaps, of course, kids are going to fall through the crack. And of course, that's a moment where they can be, manipulated, and we know that trafficking happens in the most vulnerable situations. And so really collaborating with schools, we know that you obviously are not the ones implementing those policies. Sometimes those are state policies, oftentimes those are county policies, but what is your relationship with your schools right now? And even the school board to amend those school policies and exclusionary disciplinary practices, to address those roots and to consider other solutions for truancy. And so again, there are multiple things that you can do, but mentorship programs, alternative education programs, just ways to kind of understand, asking again, why kids aren't actually coming in the first place. What does school discipline look like, and why, and what are ways to kind of help you to stay there? David and I were just venting yesterday about how infuriating is oftentimes when school practices where youth who doesn't come to school often is expelled. It doesn't make any sense to me that a kid that is not coming, their punishment is that they further don't get to come to school. Just what can we do to create connections? One thing that I have found that has been successful with some programs is identifying education school partners. And so, for example, you might have it in your community. Communities and Schools is a nonprofit that basically sends out additional case workers to work with youth who are particularly having a difficult time, to work one-on-one with them. You know, where are some of those inroads, especially if you're having a hard time reaching those educators? Can you reach out to their partners to see a way that you can contribute there? So at the time of arrest or intake at detention center, you know, kind of just going again through the bullet points, engaging child welfare systems to maintain victim focus, to place youth in therapeutic groups, and connect youth with services. So many of you guys know this and know this so well, connecting youth to community residential programs, taking youth to trauma responsive and therapeutic residential centers, placements at homes with safe families. I know specialized foster care trains families to offer placement and treatment for youth with histories of chronic and severe delinquency. Typically, youth are closely supervised at home, in the community, and at school. Foster care parents typically receive special training on the needs of youth involved in the juvenile justice system and have access to additional resources to address special situations. If they do not in your communities, is there a way to remedy that as well, to make sure that they're getting trained and getting support? Parents provide one-on-one mentoring and consistent discipline for rule violations. You know, and this is a moment too where kind of speaking, David and I spoke yesterday about and he already mentioned today, MOUs and holding every stakeholder accountable. And I know several of you guys have task forces where you're monitoring youth in that sense and trying to make sure that they are being case managed kind of across and consistently. I work with King County, the CSEC program in King County, Washington. And they have a system that they just started implementing that when a youth is detained, their CSEC program is immediately contact, so that they know who is in there, and the screening process almost happens immediately. So they're a way to kind of monitor to make sure that they're not losing kids in the process. David, I know that we had a lot to talk about with this slide yesterday. Anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think I was just going to touch two things. And one is we do a lot in the area, and my own experience was as a child abuse prosecutor. And so what is the role, if any, for the child advocacy centers in your various communities? Can we plug it in? Is that a gateway ultimately to engage your first bullet point, the child welfare system? So what role, if any? So again, as we try to build this out, is there a role for those advocacy centers, and how do we do it? And then the second piece is, Jay, is exactly what you said. I know from reviewing a number of your grants, MDTs come up, so multidisciplinary team. What I don't know is who's on that team. And is there somebody missing? Should that team be built out a little bit? And then how formal is it? As was discussed, MOUs, protocols, again, being one of the system actors. If we want the system to respond, trying to put things down in writing, or as you said, at the time of the arrest or detention, just like the slide, what is it that you want that law enforcement agency, probation department, or prosecutor's office, what do you want them to do so that we can do better as far as keeping the kids out of detention? Because once they're in detention, now we've got an additional struggle to get them back out. So we'd like to cut them off early, but thank you.
And again, I just want to reiterate, we know that we're preaching to the choir here, that so many of you have set into these systems in place. But again, this is a question of where do we have gaps? Where can we reevaluate? Where can we tighten up? You know, so one recommendation is, again, I mentioned service and safety plans should be assigned by a care coordinator. You know, those of you that have MDTs, you know, how often are you meeting? What are those policies? And again, are you having an MOU? We know that turnover is such a huge issue right now across the board with service providers, with government institutions, with really any kind of system in place. And so, you know, when people leave and there's that gap, what has been already established so that you don't have to recreate the wheel every single time somebody has to rejoin or somebody leaves. So moving on, because again, I want to get to the point where we can have conversations with you. Pre-adjudication, kind of just hitting the main points. We know that prosecutors dismissing the case. Prosecutors, as we already mentioned, should consider the harms. Everyone should, for the child who has experienced, you know, the trauma as a member of the community. We know that you have to measure and evaluate the harm that has been done to that child, but also to the harm to the community itself. We understand that's a difficult balance. Probation officers, as David already mentioned, and juvenile court take-in officers, what are ways to divert them from formal processing? Again, those risk assessments are so important. And then youth should never be confined solely because they don't have relevant support services. And then again, judges diverting from the formal processing. You play such an important role in that moment and point of decision, and also why it's so important to have an MDT team to be constantly discussing the case with multiple people across the board. These services can be offered at such different levels. But in order to reduce contact between the youth and the system, collaborate again with school and law enforcement personnel to develop agreements about diverting youth without prior delinquency findings and youth alleged to have a committed misdemeanor or nonviolent offense. Diversion of youth prevents them from being confined and or having to go before a judge. So even before they get to that point, what are ways that we can divert them, to identify their needs, to recognize their trauma, and to get them those services before we kind of further push them into the system. Post-adjudication, we talk a lot about restorative justice programs, and they typically involve the victims of the crime the youth committed, and they culminate in a conference where accused youth and caring adults in their lives meet to discuss the harm caused by the offense and craft plans for the youth to make things right and to avoid subsequent offending and to achieve success. Trauma responsive and therapeutic residential centers specifically designed for youth who have been victimized. We know that these are not, depending on where you are from, depending on the resources, can be rare. Are there other places, community-based day treatment services, where youth are required to report to the treatment facility on a daily basis at specified times? Day treatment programs are designed to serve delinquent youth in a non-residential setting and to improve their academic achievement. We have some literature to kind of connect to those things. What are ways that we can get creative? What are ways that we can, once they've kind of gone through this, that we can identify again services, places, who can we reach out to and continue having those conversations with? If we can't provide them these direct services, where can we find those services? And kind of wrapping up, probation and aftercare. Can we change probation policies and procedures to incentivize positive behavior and promote the growth of young people as opposed to punitive responses to violations of probations? We know that the justice system, the traditional ways that it's worked, how can we be creative to try to help that youth find value, to do skill building? We do a lot of conversations about how to incentivize youth in juvenile drug treatment courts. We know that model is not exactly the same, but youth, it just overall, in my experience with them, respond so much more positively when they have things to reach for instead of things to be kind of blamed for. And so what are ways that we can kind of enhance those? And again, collaborating, engaging, safe and affirming family and kin. I understand that this can be very difficult, especially we know that familiar trafficking is so common, which is devastating. But the question to ask for youth that you're working with too is, who are their players and who are their community members outside of those families? One question that we posed in working with some of our stakeholders in our sites and engaging youth is asking them, just simple questions like, who would you call if you got arrested? Who would you call if you got in trouble? Who would you call if you wanted to celebrate good news? And oftentimes, specifically with some of the youth that we work with, it's not going to be their family members. And so how can we reach out and find community outside of it? Because we know that so oftentimes what leads them and tempts them into being placed in a vulnerable situation to be trafficked is a lack of community, a lack of foundation, right? And then again, automatic expungement for all youth and their cases are closed. Several of the sites that I worked with have this built into place specifically with their human trafficking dockets, and which is incredible for youth to just be able to have that kind of freedom. Anything to add here, David, before we kind of move into the discussion phase?
Yes, I would just encourage all to have their voices heard, because this slide is talking about what do you do? What kind of a plan can you make? And I look to all of you, you're already working with them. So let's make sure that we lift up your work and direction. So I think that's a really important thing for those that don't have that sort of direct connect. Let's get it put together. And then also to reinforce the expungement issue is let's get that record expunged and sealed, especially we're talking about juvenile cases. So let's get rid of it as soon as it says here. As soon as the case is closed, let's make it go away.
For those that don't have automatic expungement, but you want it, that process is there and possible. Another question to ask is, one, how can you make it automatic? But then also, two, we know how convoluted the juvenile justice system can be for ourselves. How, you know, like, we know obviously how crazy it can be for a youth who are already going through so many things. So who's explaining that process to them? Who's following up in that process with them? Whose role does that play? And again, that goes back to the idea of MOUs and understanding what is the services that each of us offer to that youth and how do we explain that? You know, and alternatives to detaining and criminalizing youth should never be mandatory, court order, or punitive. Youth who choose not to participate in activities should not be forced to return to court or punished in some other manner, right? And again, kind of discussing this lack of community. So one last slide, and then we're going to move on to kind of discussing all the things that we've talked about today. Again, many of them that I'm probably sure you know. So looking through all of the things that we discussed, what are some alternatives to detention in your community's juvenile justice system that you are utilizing? So ones that we've identified in today's presentation, but also ones that maybe we don't know about. Because again, we want to take as much as we can from you as well to share with other sites. So again, if you can mention what are some alternatives you are using. Case management and mentoring, community-based, community programming. It's a very popular one. And while we're waiting for people to respond, those community partners, again, how often are they interacting with the juvenile justice system players? What can we learn and teach from each other? We've talked a lot about in our site visits, sector, cross-discipline training. Housing, yes, I can't believe I haven't even talked about housing. Housing services are so important, and I know that we're lacking them, but that's a huge thing. More holistic placements. Anything that you're seeing, David, that you want to kind of point out?
Well, I think one is the reality here. Residential treatment is the goal, but not enough beds. So I think that's one we've got to all work together. Can we get more? But even more importantly, where are those beds? Because that seems to be at the time of the need. And I love the comment there about the emergency foster care. But is that well known how you can get somebody placed, especially because these cases don't come in generally during business hours or regular business hours.
And we already mentioned, as we know, that this is such a difficult issue. Also I spoke to several of you during our site visits about the kind of legislative effort. Obviously, we can't endorse anything, but are the people that are making those decisions, are figuring out funding, do they understand how much that need is? And what are ways to show that narrative to make them understand that this is a huge thing, right? Respite support youth and managing crisis, yes. I have an idea who probably put that down, but again, what are ways that we're being creative when we lack the resources that we have? Thank you for participating. We are going to move into, I see you, Melissa. We're moving into the breakout sessions. And I, as promised, probably went a little bit over how long I wanted to talk to. So let's do this, Bobby, let's do 10 minutes instead of 15 minutes. But we're going to move you into breakout rooms. They will be randomized. You don't have to take yourself off of camera, but please do what you can to engage in the conversation. But in these breakout rooms, they'll be facilitated by myself, by Lauren, by David. Can you just take a moment to discuss what alternatives in detention are not being used in your community? We identified what is not being used. What would you need to do in order to have that alternative implemented? Who would you need to work with? And then finally, because we have David here, because we know that this is such a huge player, how can prosecutors assist in implementing alternatives to detention? What needs to be done to build relationships with them? We just want you to have a kind of free-form conversation. I'm talking a little too much now, but just a reminder that the power in these peer-to-peers is discussion with each other. So if we can take that 10 minutes, we'll be moved into groups. We're really here just to listen, and then I'll also post the questions in the chat so that each of our facilitators can have them. I did the one thing I told myself I was going to do, not overtalk, but so we have a few minutes to kind of elaborate, and then I just want to remind everybody about our next peer-to-peer, but I'll just briefly kind of point out some of the things that were said in my group that I thought were really interesting. There's a mention that recognizing that not all alternatives work for every youth. So again, having that availability in that spectrum of different decisions and really thinking about case management and how to identify, individualizing those plans. People in my group were very honest about the relationship with prosecutors. Some have great relationships. And one of the reasons why was that we talked a lot about MDTs and how valuable they are. But they have to have a kind of a set schedule. We have to get the right people to the table. But that being said, I'm just going to point out, Melissa mentioned from Sacramento County that their MDT is actually, or one of their MDTs is actually run by their court themselves. And so it was really easy for, the prosecutors, the judge, the probation officers to be part of that program because they're the ones running it. That is not the case with many other sites. So then the question becomes, how do we give them more of a role to kind of take ownership of the work? I thought was really interesting. So Lauren or David, any kind of quick things to add from your conversations with your groups?
Like I was teasing you, we were just getting to the good point. I think one of the keys, again, goes back to, and this came from one of the prosecutors. They've got a victim that's been in detention now 67 days because there is no home. So we were just getting to Mary Kate really Linda Powers about what, if anything, can be done to build out more safe houses. And so it's not, this is what we've always done, or this is the only appropriate place. So I think resources came up a lot, but appreciate, we had a very prosecutor heavy group. And so the role of prosecutor was central to our discussion.
I think we talked a lot about, again, those challenges within the different placements, not having, placements in the locations that will best support young people, not having well-trained placements, turnover in placements, those aspects, as well as, not necessarily taking advantage of prosecutorial discretion, and not necessarily looking at the full youth experience, and then if anyone from my group has an addition, because they all had great things to say and were wonderful.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody conversations. Any last minute things to add to that conversation really quick before we move on? And I apologize that we didn't have more time to discuss. Okay, well, there'll be plenty of opportunities. Really quick, I'm just going to show you this last screen, but while I do, I noticed in my breakout room that we are joined today by Cindy. Cindy is representing the Office of Victims of Crimes. Many of you know her, but I'm just going to give her a chance to, say hello. So hi, Cindy, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, hi, thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity, and I hope everyone is getting as much from each other as I'm learning from you all. So thank you again so much for gathering us here today.
Thanks, Cindy. So a reminder that we have these peer-to-peer meetings every quarter. Our next one will be on March 7th. We have our topics that we have covered, but really we want this to work for you. So if there are things that you would want us to further see, if you want more discussions, if there are topics, please let your site managers know, let me know, and we can kind of craft it. We want these to be helpful to you. If there are other stakeholders that you think should be invited, that would be very specific to your site manager, but let them know, and we can make sure that we add them to the invite. You are welcome to to share with them. If you've come to today's meeting, we assume that you've registered, and because you registered, you should be getting a reminder. Last but not least, there is an evaluation survey. Fabi, I forgot to copy the link, but if you could throw it into the chat right now. We literally seriously look at that data. So if you can just do the evaluation survey quickly before you leave us today and let us know what you would like to see, what went well with this meeting. But I want to thank David for being here, for his expertise. I want to thank all of you for contributing and having the conversations. I hope something was valuable to you from this meeting. But that's kind of my final comments. Anything last things to say, David, before we let everybody go?
Just thank you for your time, and very much look forward to feedback, roles, responsibilities, and the ways that we can help use the prosecutor component to push this forward. Because and I love the fact that someone already commented about, it's what we've always done, or it's the best interest of the kid. I think we can do a lot better, but we need to do it together.
Thanks, David. Sherry, Lauren, any kind of final comments? It's okay if you don't. Okay. Well, please again do the evaluation survey. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to seeing you on March 7th. Bye all.